Throughout Better Call Saul and Breaking Bad, we see Mike Ehrmantraut make numerous half measures, like letting Walter live, or taking a beating for Tuco, or even going the extra mile not to kill a truck driver working for the cartel. And this complex morality always comes back to bite him in the worst way, because just like falling dominoes, each half measure would have more repercussions later on for him. And in this video, we're going to take a look at every half measure Mike took and what would have happened if he just gone all the way. So let's kick things off with Mike's earliest half measure, which takes place when he was a beat cop in Philadelphia, and in Season 3, Episode 12 of Breaking Bad, Mike tells Walter how he dealt with a domestic violence case, one where a wife was constantly being abused by her husband. And for as many times that Mike and his partner brought him in, the most that would happen is the man spending a night in jail because the wife didn't want to press charges. But one night, when Mike's partner was out sick, he tried to deal with this issue himself, and he went as far as putting the gun in the man's face and warning him to just back off. And as he was begging for his life, Mike assumed that he would stop the abuse, and he let him go. But that's when he was proven to be completely wrong, because 2 weeks later, he found out that his actions were a direct result of that same woman being murdered by her husband. And this forced Mike to accept that there was another way of dealing with these kind of matters, one that he had to get his hands dirty for.
I chose a half measure, when I should have gone all the way. I'll never make that mistake again.
Yeah, you will, Mike. Trust me, I got the complete list. And as we would see, Mike would eventually have to get his hands dirty. But what if he planned to do so from the start? Well, if he did, Mike could have handled that situation a few different ways, with the most likely scenario being to just kill the man off. He could have staged a mugging or an accident, and the man could have easily been out the picture. However, this would also be Mike's first kill as a cop, and turning him into a colder, harder version of himself with less patience when things don't go his way. And somewhere down the line, this would mean straight up killing anybody who interrupted his business. Most likely starting with Gus with that letter on the windshield, but as we clearly see, that wouldn't seem to be the case, as Mike still deals with people in a non-lethal way. Like for example, letting Tuco Salamanca live.
This snatch.
Now, in Better Call Saul, Mike meets Nacho Varga through a series of side deals with Mike being a bodyguard for a low-level pill supplier named Price.
It's me! I got a new car! You like it?
But when Nacho tells Mike that Tuco can't find out about his side business, he offers to pay him 50 grand to kill his boss. Because with the unpredictable nature of Tuco being on drugs, it would spell out disaster if he even thought that Nacho was working against him.
When he's using loco, crazy. If Tuco finds out about my, independent ventures, it's gonna be dog all over again.
And after agreeing to this offer, later on we would see Mike about to buy a gun. But then he would hesitate and opting for what would be another half measure. Because although the world would be a much better place without Tuco in it, Mike considers the effect that this would have on Nacho, knowing that if he did pull the trigger, the cartel would come after him or his dad. So instead, he would try to get the job done without any blood on the scene.
There's no killing but your Tuco problem. It goes away.
So Mike's plan would be to get Tuco arrested for assault and setting him off one step at a time. He starts by crashing into Tuco's car and acting clueless when confronted.
You just hit my car. You're talking to me.
Then Mike irritates Tuco by refusing to hand over his wallet to pay for damages.
I'm not giving you a damn thing.
After Tuco flashes his gun at Mike, he would eventually hand over the wallet. But then he grabs onto Tuco's shirt, which only makes him angrier, and he starts to punch and beat on Mike all the way up until the cops arrive. And after watching that scene, Mike literally took every punch with a smile, and he even asked for more.
On the ground! That all you got?
And you would think that after Tuco went to jail, the problem would be solved. But when Hector Salamanca steps into his life, he's faced with a whole new set of problems. Because when he tries to bribe Mike for Tuco to get a lesser charge, and he refuses, he would now be put on the radar of the Salamancas. And after sending some guys to Mike's house didn't work, Hector would send the Salamanca twins to track down Mike's granddaughter at a hotel and threatening his family if he doesn't comply. And not wanting to put his loved ones in harm's way, Mike would be forced to take Hector's offer, but only after he was paid 50 grand from Hector himself.
I got my money. Or neither of us walk out of here.
So Mike's half measure for dealing with Tuco in a non-lethal way only led to him getting directly involved with the Salamancas and even putting his family's life at risk. But had Mike just gone forward with the initial plan of killing Tuco, things would have turned out differently. Not just for him, but for the entire Breaking Bad timeline. Because not only would the target be removed from his back, but by taking the shot that he was so positive that he could make, there would just be no chance of anyone ever suspecting him, and he could have gotten his money from Nacho and continued to live his life without any threat to his family. But because he did go with this half measure, he tried to make it up by going all the way and bringing us to one of Mike's most perfect opportunities for revenge. Because even after being paid and Hector completely forgetting about him, the same could not be said about Mike, who still holds a grudge towards him. And after robbing a truck holding $250,000, it would almost be enough for Mike to let it go. But by doing another half measure and letting the truck driver live, he's told by Nacho that a good Samaritan came to help out the truck driver only to be shot in the face by Hector.
And that good Samaritan?
Hector shot him in the face.
And that, combined with the threat on his family, Mike decides that something has to be done about Hector, and he picks up his rifle to finish him off once and for all. But right as he's about to pull the trigger, he'd find a note on his car that reads the word, "Don't." And after doing his own detective work, Mike later finds out that the note was left by Gus. And during a brief introduction where he shows off his aura, Mike would eventually back off Hector and start working for the Chicken Man. But little did Gus know, that same note would sign his death warrant, as Hector would be used as the perfect tool to collapse his empire. But just imagine if Mike ignored Gus's note and followed his gut. Not only would Hector be gone, but I'm sure that Gus would have Mike killed as well. But would that stop the cartel from assuming that Gus didn't give the order? Probably not. Especially with their not-so-secret hatred for each other. And how would that conversation even go? Would Gus just say, "Yeah, this guy killed Hector. I know because I watched him do it." And Don Eladio would say, "And you didn't try to stop him? I mean, I gave him a note and he still did it anyway. What else do you want me to do?" So, yeah, it's just not a convincing argument that could be made. I'm sure if Gus met with the cartel and tried to explain that as what happened, I'm sure he'd get killed the same way that his partner did. And with Gus, Mike, and Hector out the picture, in this scenario, Walter would have to work alone, and he would have likely got caught not long after starting his meth operation. But even with all these possibilities, Mike's half-measure policy never let them occur. And this would mirror the same situation that Mike has with his new friend, Werner Ziegler, a German architect who led the construction on Gus's meth lab. And with Mike being the head of operations for construction, him and Werner began to hit it off as friends, and he even grew a soft spot for Werner. But only a few months into the construction process, he tells Mike that he's never been away from his wife for this long, and he's starting to get depressed without her. And he even floated the idea of Mike letting him leave for the weekend to go and see her. But when Mike wasn't going along with him, he later played it off as a joke. And despite Warner's odd behavior, Mike doesn't give more than a thought to it. But to meet his friend halfway, he lets him call his wife and stays on the phone for as long as he wants. And thinking that Warner's got it out of his system, Mike leaves for the night. But when the next day rolls around and Mike checks the cameras, he finds out that Werner had escaped. And as soon as Gus finds out, he orders for Mike and his men to track him down and kill him. But even after realizing that Warner's escape was a huge risk for the operation, Mike still doesn't want to kill off Werner. And after tracking him down through some money transfers and a few hotel calls, Mike tries to get Gus to let him return alive. But Gus refuses, and since Warner's escape gave Lalo an excuse to start looking around the laundry, he wants Werner gone. And not given much of an opportunity to save his friend, Mike has to accept the order. And after getting him on the line with his wife to ensure that she's safe, Mike would have to be the one to put him down to spare him from a far worse fate through Gus's men. And all this happened because Mike developed a soft spot for Werner, which caused him to let a lot of his behavior slip through the cracks and making him commit another half measure by loosening his grip on security. But what if Mike made sure to keep his security top notch? Werner would have never gotten a chance to escape to begin with, and this would have been for his own good. He could have continued with the operation, then reunited with his wife, and retired a very rich man. And more importantly, if he didn't escape, he wouldn't have sparked Lalo's interest in Gus's operation. And without any clue of what was being built at the laundry, Lalo would have just been another person in the dark about Gus's plans. But instead, the half measure Mike took caused him to lose someone he was close to, and the aftermath would be turning into a weapon for Gus and accepting his role as the enforcer that we see in Breaking Bad. But when he's also on the payroll of Saul Goodman as a private investigator, sometimes all he can do is give advice as opposed to demands, such as telling him not to work with Walter White.
Well, listen, even if this guy was gonna live, I wouldn't go near him. He's a complete amateur.
When it came to the partnership between Walter and Saul, for the right amount of cash, he would have done anything for his client. From poisoning kids, laundering money, or fake calls to the DEA, nothing was off the table for Walter. And even with all these scenes playing out in front of him, Mike doesn't bother to cut off Walter from Saul, something he had plenty of opportunities to stop. But because he was a piece on the chessboard that Gus was playing on, Mike kept Walter safe as an expendable asset to the business. But all that would change if Mike decided to take matters into his own hands. Because if he chose to cut off Saul right from the start, Walter's business would have ended the moment Badger got arrested. And if by some miracle Badger kept his mouth shut and Walter continued his meth operation, he wouldn't have gotten far. Because true to Mike's word, he would have either got a bullet to the head or caught by the cops.
If the cancer doesn't get him, it'll be the cops or a bullet to the head.
And that's true because there's no world in which Walter gets away without Saul's help. Because if it wasn't for him introducing Walter to Gus, chances are that the competition would have came to shut the blue meth operation down. Either that or the Salamanca twins coming to put an axe through his head. And without Walter in the picture, Saul wouldn't have lost everything that he had and would likely still be the criminal lawyer that we all come to know and love. But even after coming to terms with Walter as a hazard, Mike still underestimates how much of a liability Jesse can be. Because after he finds out that Andrea's brother was involved in Combo's murder, Jesse plans for revenge on the drug dealers for involving a child. But with them being Gus's men, a meeting is called and peace would be demanded between Jesse and the rival dealers. And although Jesse accepts with a handshake, everything goes south after Tomas was shot dead at a playground. And when Jesse finds out, he heads over with a gun to confront the dealers, but Walter would have other plans. But let's talk about how he got here. Because early that same day, just after Walter dropped Jesse off to his car, he goes to Saul's office to try to get Jesse arrested so he couldn't kill Gus's dealers. But when Mike catches on to Walter's plan, he pays him a visit at his house and warns him to handle the situation with Jesse himself. And basically implying that if he were to just kill Jesse, things would go so much smoother for everyone at that point. But instead, Walter took a different approach and it led to this moment that we see right here. But what would have happened if Mike went to Gus the moment he found out about Walter's plan? I think in that scenario, Gus would have been watching over the drug dealers the entire night. And when he saw Walter run them over with his car, it's a good chance that he would have confronted both Walter and Jesse right there. And Gus would have likely got his hands dirty and killed Jesse the same way he did Arturo in Better Call Saul, just to send a message. And as for Walter, I think he lived for one more cook before he's replaced by Gale and never seen again. Because even though it was Jesse who Gus had a problem with, Walter was the one to run him over with his car. And his actions proved that he just couldn't be trusted in this operation. But Mike's half measures continue to happen even more towards Walter throughout the rest of the show. Because one of Mike's biggest half measures was sparing Walter. Because after he chose to run over the rival dealers, a decision was made shortly after meeting with Gus to explain himself. And although he gave Walter the impression that he was going to let him live throughout the end of their contract, his life was contingent on Gale learning the recipe. And after Gus was confident in his new chemist, he gave Mike the order to have Walter eliminated.
Mike, you don't have to do this.
Yeah, unfortunately I do, Walter.
And what should have been something taken care of very easily, Mike would fall for Walter's manipulation on giving up Jesse's location. And when he allowed him to make a call, he would instead be setting off the plan to kill Gale. So because Mike spared Walter even when he shouldn't have, it eventually led to the demise of Gus Fring. And when giving Walter enough time, he came up with a plan to lure him into a meeting with Hector Salamanca. And in the blink of an eye, or the tap of a bell, he removed Gus as a threat once and for all. But can we all just imagine what Breaking Bad would have looked like if Mike never let Walter make that phone call and instead just brought him down to the lab and finished him off? Because with Walter dead at that point in time, it would have meant that Gale lives and the operation continues. And maybe they wouldn't have had the exact recipe for Walter's formula, but Gale was still a good chemist at the end of the day. And as for Jesse, I'm sure Mike would have found him eventually. After all, he was still in town, so how long could he really hang out at an arcade for? So, in reality, Mike's hesitation led to Walter completing his transformation into Heisenberg and eventually working for the same man that he wanted to kill. But I guess that's karma. And speaking of which, I don't think I've ever seen karma come back around on someone as it did for Lydia Rodart-Quayle. Because after the death of Gus Fring, Mike attempts to clean up the drug empire of any loose ends. But he's surprised to find out that someone put a hit out on him, and that person was Lydia. And because of her paranoid nature, she would want anyone who knew of her involvement in the drug operation to be dead, including the 9 guys that were already in jail. And after Mike was forced to kill one of his own men, his next stop would be Lydia's home. And right when he was getting ready to shoot her, he reconsiders after she brings up her daughter.
My daughter's not thinking I abandoned her.
Shut up.
And I mean, I kind of get this one because Mike was probably starting to think of his own granddaughter at the time. So instead of leaving her dead at the scene, he would make a proposition for her to provide them with methylamine for their new operation. And in exchange, he'll let her live. But that decision would have one of the most ripple effects in the show, because after Mike's death and Walter goes on the run, Lydia works with Todd to ensure the drug business keeps going. And to keep the product at a high quality, Jesse is kept as a slave to cook meth. And even when Lydia was told about the conditions that Jesse was kept in, all she would care about is her profit margin. So what I'm saying here is, if Mike decided not to be sexist and just kill off Lydia, and I'm not just saying that, he said it himself.
I had a chance to deal with this before, and I gave her a pass. That's what I get for being sexist. Now, if you excuse me.
But if he did kill Lydia, the train heist never happens, Drew Sharp lives, and everyone retires early. That means no Todd, no Jack, or any of the Nazi members even entering the game, and this would also change Walter's death. He would have likely died from cancer rather than a stray bullet from his own gun. And not to mention that Hank's still surviving, as well as Steve Gomez and Andrea. So when you really think about it, Mike not killing Lydia is probably one of the most crucial half measures he ever took. But I'd be lying to you if I said that Mike killing Lydia wouldn't have been more satisfying than Walter killing Lydia, because, I mean, I'm just gonna play the clip.
He's gone. They're all gone.
Todd?
It's Walt. How are you feeling? Like you've got the flu? That would be the ricin I gave you. I slipped it into that stevia crap that you're always putting in your tea. Oh, thank God.
But ultimately, Mike's biggest half measure was how he dealt with Walter after Gus's death. A mistake that cost him his life in return. Because all he had to do was put a bullet in Walter's head. And there was no better time to do so than when he found out about Gus's murder. Because while Mike was feeding chickens and recovering in Mexico, as soon as he heard about what happened to Gus, he knew exactly who was responsible. And he wasted no time driving through the desert to get to Walter. And right when he was ready to shoot him, Jesse jumps between the two and begs Mike to listen. And once he calmed down enough, Walter tells Mike that the DEA has Gus's laptop and they could have footage of them cooking. And with this being a more pressing issue, they work together to deal with the problem at hand. But even after taking care of the laptop problem, Mike and Walter never picked up where they left off at. And realistically, Mike should have just followed through in this scene and just killed Walter, because even if Jesse got in the way, it's not like he couldn't move him.
Mike? Well, get out of my way, you sit down. Mike!
But if Mike carried out the liberty of shooting Walter, everything would have been for the better, even more than killing Lydia. Because Walter's death could have meant finally cutting loose of the drug empire, meaning no new recruits like Todd or Jack. And speaking of Lydia, her death would be inevitable at this point, as her methylamine resources wouldn't mean anything to them. And if they were just to hold out for a little while longer, they would realize that Gus had an encryption on his laptop, making it impossible for anyone to view the files. Because remember, it was the magnet that broke the picture frame that was hiding the account information for all the people in prison. So if Mike killed Walter and just did nothing, everything would be fine for him and Jesse. But sadly, things went a different way. And in the end, the code Mike made for himself was something that he chose not to follow. And because of his own hypocrisy and lack of judgment, it was a mistake that cost him his life. And while bleeding out, I'm sure the regret was starting to...
Shut the fuck up. Let me die in peace. Chemistry is...